Welcome to the InnoGuide Podcast, where we share the works of authors and mentors to guide innovation. In this episode, number 35, we'll be sharing Storyworthy, Part 2 by Matthew Dix. Today we'll be picking up where we left off at Chapter 12. We are in Part 2 of Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. In the earlier chapters, we discussed how every story takes only 5 seconds to tell, how you find your beginning. He spoke about stakes and 5 ways to keep your story compelling, the 5 permissible lies of storytelling, and that every story needs to be a cinema of the mind to keep the reader engaged. So now we're picking up at Chapter 12, the principle of but and therefore. Let me take you into my 5th grade classroom for a moment. Every Monday morning, I invite my students to share their one-sentence weekends. It's a simple exercise. They tell me the most important or momentous thing that happened to them over the weekend, but they have to do it in just one sentence. Why do I do this? Well, for a few reasons. First, kids love to tell me about their weekends, and I don't have the time or patience to hear about every cousin's birthday party or early morning soccer game in excruciating detail. This exercise gives them a chance to share something meaningful without overwhelming me. Second, I'm secretly teaching them to find their 5-second moments, the most interesting or compelling part of their weekend. I don't use that exact language with them, but I do encourage them to think about what's worth sharing and what's not. And yes, my school psychologist has gently suggested that shouting boring or yawn city at a student might not be the best teaching strategy. But hey, it works. Third, I'm reinforcing grammar. They have to compose their thoughts in a single sentence, avoiding run-ons. And finally, I'm teaching active listening. When a student shares something genuinely interesting, I ask follow-up questions, sometimes even letting them expand their story. But as I listen to these stories, I realize why so many of them fell flat. The culprit? The word and. My students love to string their sentences together with and, creating a never-ending chain of events that lacks any real structure or meaning. Here's an example of one student's story. My cousin Lisa came over for a sleepover, and we went to bed on time, and we didn't sleep. When everyone was asleep, we snuck downstairs and watched TV. And my parents heard us, and they thought the voices on the TV were burglars robbing the house. And they called the police. They didn't wake us up because they didn't want us to be scared, and they didn't check my room. My dad waited upstairs with a baseball bat. The police came to the house and saw us watching TV through the window. They called my parents and told them it was us downstairs, and we got in so much trouble. Now, this story has potential. It's got humor, stakes, bit of chaos, but it's told poorly. The constant use of and makes us feel like it's a laundry list of events rather than a cohesive story. What's missing is causation, the glue that holds the story together. This is where the principle of but and therefore comes in. It's a concept I borrowed from Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park. They argue that a good story isn't just a series of events connected by and. Instead, each event should be linked by but or therefore. These words create causation and conflict, which are the heart of any great story. Let me rewrite the student's story using this principle. My cousin Lisa came over for a sleepover. We went to bed on time, but we couldn't sleep. Therefore, we snuck downstairs to watch TV. But my parents heard the voices and thought burglars were robbing the house. Therefore, they called the police. But they didn't check my room because they didn't want to scare us. Therefore, my dad waited upstairs with a baseball bat while the police investigated. But the police saw us through the window and called my parents, who realized it was just us. Therefore, we got in so much trouble. See the difference? Suddenly the story has tension, stakes, and a sense of progression. It's no longer a list of events, it's a narrative. This principle doesn't just apply to storytelling. It's a way about thinking about life, about how events are connected, about how we make sense of them. It's about finding the meaning in the chaos, the causation, and the randomness. When you start to think this way, you'll find that your stories and your life become a lot more interesting. Chapter 13. This is going to suck. I'm going to tell you another story now. I mentioned it in the previous chapter. I'm telling the story here because it serves as an excellent model for the next couple of chapters. I first told the story at a Moth Grand Slam in New York City. I finished in first place that night. Then I expanded the story and told it at a Moth main stage in Pittsburgh, and it's since aired on the Moth Radio Hour. It's December 23rd, 1988. I'm 17 years old. Coming out of a record store. As I hit the sidewalk, my friend Pat sees me. He asks me what's in the shopping bag I'm holding. I tell him it's a concert t-shirt. It's a Christmas present for Benji, our friend, and my best friend. A surprise Christmas present. Pat looks at me a little funny. He's only 14, but he's already cooler than I'll ever be in my entire life. So when he looks at me like that, I always pay attention. Pat tells me that guys don't buy Christmas presents for other guys, especially surprise Christmas presents. He tells me he's had girlfriends for 6 months and never bought them a thing. So for me to buy Benji a Christmas present is a little odd. Suddenly feeling very self-conscious about the betta fish in the back seat of my car, the one that I bought at a pet store for Pat an hour ago, and the comic books for Coog, and the sweatshirt for Tom, and all the presents I bought for my friends on that day. I know that Pat is right. It's strange that I've done this, but it's been a long time since I've had a good Christmas, and I want this one to be special. Combination of my unending childhood poverty, my absentee mother, my evil stepfather, now their failing marriage has made every Christmas for years a misery. But for the first time in my life, I have money in my pocket. I'm a manager at McDonald's making $5.75 an hour. I'm working full-time while I'm in high school, and I'm the richest person I know. I'm going to use this money to buy myself a great Christmas. I am headed home now. I need to get my uniform because I have a shift at McDonald's later, and I need to get these presents into the house. I need to get the betta fish out of the cold. It's starting to snow out. It's kind of lovely. I'm driving my mother's 1976 Datsun B210, a car about the size of a box of Pop-Tarts, through the town of Mendon, Massachusetts. The lawns of each home are turning white. It's the first snowfall of the year. As I drive by each house, it's as if I'm passing a picture postcard of Christmas. I feel this might be a good Christmas after all. I'm coming around a corner and I'm headed down a hill when my car starts sliding to the opposite lane on the snowy road. I look up and I see a white Mercedes-Benz coming right at me. They say in moments like this, time will slow down or even freeze, and it's absolutely true. In the 3 seconds it takes before our two cars hit head-on, I have exactly 3 thoughts. The first is, I'm not wearing my seatbelt. I always wear my seatbelt, but in the excitement of buying Christmas presents and the rush to get home, I've forgotten to put it on the worst day of my life to forget. My second thought is, in moments like this, I've been told to steer into the skid, but it occurs to me now that I don't know what the hell that really means, and I still don't know to this day. My third thought is just one sentence. It's 5 words long, and I say it aloud. This is going to suck. And it does. When our cars collide, I'm thrown forward, and my head crashes through the windshield. My chin catches the steering wheel on the way, and the entire bottom row of my teeth comes flying out and into the back of my mouth in one large chunk. The same moment my legs come forward, my right leg becomes embedded down to the bone in the air conditioning unit. My left leg hits the emergency release brake, knocking the handle off and skewering my left leg. My chest crashes into the steering wheel, breaking ribs and knocking all the air from my lungs. It's all over in a second, then shock descends upon me, and I feel no pain or fear. I climb out of the car. I'm sort of crumpled next to the car, half standing, half crouching. When I see the woman in the Mercedes get out, she's completely unharmed. Her seatbelt and the size of her car have protected her completely. Then she sees me, vomits, and passes out. The first to arrive at the scene is a pickup truck full of teenagers. A kid about my age gets to me first. He lies me down in the mud and the snow on the side of the road. He gives me a look over, and then he crouches close to my ear and whispers, "Dude, you're fucked." It's the most accurate medical assessment that I will receive that day. Police officer arrives and puts a coat on me to keep me warm. I've got broken ribs, so it feels like 1,000 pounds. I'm looking up at the white sky, and the snow is really starting to fall now, so I close my eyes. When I open my eyes again, I'm in an ambulance. A young woman is straddling my hips, and she's pounding on my chest, which is now on fire. There's a man trying to shove a clear tube down my throat, and the woman starts screaming, "He's back! He's back!" And I'm wondering, who the hell is back? It's me, I'm back. I find out later that my heart stopped beating and I stopped breathing for about a minute. No white light. Now I'm in the emergency room and the doctors get to work on me right away. They're picking out glass from my forehead with tweezers. They're getting my legs ready for surgery. Dental surgeons wire that chunk of teeth back down into my jaw. It's the most painful thing I've ever felt. A nurse comes over and asks me for my phone number. My clothes were cut off at the scene, so I have no ID. I give her my parents' number, and then I give her the number for the McDonald's because I'm supposed to be working that night. She sort of scoffs at this and looks at me as if I'm crazy, which I kind of am. I was dead 20 minutes ago, and now I'm worried about work, but that drive-through does not run well without me, and they're going to have to get someone in. Bless her heart, she makes the call. As the doctors and nurses work on me, I notice that their expressions begin to change. I see it because I'm thinking the same thing they are. Where the hell are my parents? I'll find out later that when they heard I was in stable condition, they went to check the car out first. I won't see them before surgery. I'm waiting for a surgeon because it's December 23rd and they're hard to find. I'm waiting and waiting and waiting. I'm feeling as alone as I've ever felt. But I'm not alone because when the nurse called McDonald's to tell them about the accident, the manager on duty told my friends, and those friends started calling other friends. An old-fashioned phone tree begins, with friends calling friends calling friends, and the entire waiting room is now filling up with 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds in ripped jeans and concert T-shirts, and one 14-year-old boy who is cooler than all of them. And my friend Benji is the first one to arrive. They can't come into the emergency room to see me because they're not family, but when the nurses realize that my parents won't be arriving in time, they roll my gurney to the other side of the emergency room, they open a door, and one by one, each of my friends stands in the doorway and they wave as they give me the thumbs up. The boys say incredibly inappropriate things to make me laugh, and the girls tell me they love me, and I can hear them chanting my name as I'm rolled into the operating room. None of the presents ever make it into my friends' hands. Benji never gets his concert T-shirt, and Coog never gets his comic books, and the beta fish is the only fatality in the accident that day. But it turns out that Pat is wrong. You can give your friends surprise Christmas presents because they gave me the best one I've ever received. They give me family, and until I meet my wife 15 years later, they are the only family that I have, and it turns out they're the only family that I need. Chapter 14. The secret to the big story. Make it little. Let's talk about big stories. You know, the ones that seem larger than life, like surviving a car crash, being brought back to life, or escaping a burning building. These are the kinds of stories that people think are easy to tell because they're packed with drama and stakes. But big stories are the hardest to tell. Why? Because they're often so unique and extraordinary that they're hard for most people to relate to. And storytelling at its core is about connection. Take my story, This Is Going to Suck. It's about a head-on collision, a near-death experience, and being brought back to life in an ambulance. Sounds like a slam dunk for storytelling, right? But no one in the audience is going to hear about my head going through a windshield and think, oh yeah, I've been there. The big parts of the story, dying, the violence of the crash, are so singular that they can actually create distance between me and the audience. So what's the trick? You make the big story small. You find the little relatable moments within the larger narrative. For me, the real heart of This Is Going to Suck isn't the crash or the ambulance ride. It's the moment in the emergency room when my friends show up. That's the part that makes people cry. It's not about the violence or the near-death experience. It's about feeling alone and then realizing you're not. That's something everyone can connect to. Big stories are about the small moments. Here's the surprising thing about my big stories. They're never really about what they seem to be. Car accident? It's not about the crash. It's about my friends becoming my family. The time I was stung by a bee and my heart stopped? That story is really about my connection to my late mother. The robbery at McDonald's where a gun was pressed to my head? It's about my existential crisis and how it shaped my relationship with my kids. The big events are just the vehicles that get us to the real story. They're like the blown-out tire in my story, Charity Thief. The tire isn't the story, it's just the thing that sets everything else in motion. Find the relatable core. When you're telling a big story, you have to dig deep to find the small relatable moments. For example, I tell a story about the birth of my son Charlie. It could easily be a story about the drama of childbirth, especially since there was a life-threatening complication called a placental abruption. But that's not what the story is about. Instead, it's about expectations. How we're told childbirth is supposed to be beautiful and magical, but the reality is often messy and terrifying. And it's about my daughter Clara, who was devastated that she didn't get the baby sister she'd been dreaming of, only to fall in love with her baby brother the moment she saw him. That's the heart of the story, the unexpected beauty of love at first sight. Examples of big stories made small. A friend of mine, Monica, tells a story about surviving a plane crash. Sounds like a big story, right? But the real story isn't about the crash itself. It's about how she framed the experience for her anxious daughter. Instead of telling her daughter the terrifying truth, she turned it into an adventure story to protect her from fear. The crash is just the backdrop for a story about a mother's love and worry. Why? Big stories are hard. They're hard to tell because they require you to strip away the spectacle and focus on human connection. They're also rare. Most people don't have a lot of big stories, and that's a good thing. They're exhausting to live through and even harder to tell well. I have plenty of big stories I haven't told yet, like the time I was falsely accused of a crime or the time I escaped a high-speed police chase. Why haven't I told them? Because they're hard. They take time to craft, and they require finding the small, relatable moments that make them worth telling. The power of small stories. Small stories can be just as powerful as big ones, sometimes even more so. I'd rather tell you about the time I danced with my daughter to the Ramones on a summer evening, or the time I swallowed a penny as a kid and couldn't tell my parents. These moments might seem tiny, but they're packed with meaning and connection. They are the kind of stories that stick with people. So the next time you're tempted to tell a big story, remember it's not about the size of the event, it's about the size of the connection. Find the little moments that make the big story human, and you'll have something truly story-worthy. Chapter 15. There is only one way to make someone cry. Let me tell you about the 2 times I made my wife Alicia cry. First was on December 28, 2004, when I proposed to her at Grand Central Station, her favorite room in the world. I had planned it all out. As we reached the top of the staircase, I dropped to one knee, handed my book to a nearby police officer, and asked Alicia to marry me. Tears filled her eyes before I even finished the question. She never actually said yes. She just cried. Our friends hidden in the crowd erupted in cheers, and we celebrated with snow falling at Rockefeller Center. It was magical. The second time I made her cry was when I told her that Doubleday had made an offer on my first novel, Something Missing. I found her in the school hallway, and as soon as I started explaining, she collapsed on the floor in tears. The book deal wasn't just about money, it was about the validation of a dream. Those were the only 2 times I made her cry, and both were because of one thing: surprise. Surprise is the key to eliciting any emotional reaction in storytelling. Whether it's laughter, tears, or shock, surprise is what makes the moment land. In real life, emotions can come from many sources: grief, joy, pain, but in storytelling, we don't have the luxury of overwhelming someone with real-life experiences. We have to craft moments that catch the audience off guard. Take my story, This Is Gonna Suck. The audience gasps when I describe the car accident and the violence of my injuries. They cry when they learn my friends filled the waiting room standing in for my parents, and they laugh when I say the betta fish was the only fatality of the accident. Each of these moments works because of surprise. I set up expectations and then break them. But storytellers often ruin surprise. They give away the punchline too early, like starting a story with, "This is about the time my friends became my family." That's a thesis statement, and it kills the suspense. Instead, you need to let the story unfold naturally, revealing the surprises at just the right moments. For example, when I tell the story of my grandmother pulling my teeth, I could start with, "My grandmother was a sadist," but that ruins the surprise. Instead, I describe her tying a string around my tooth, leaning in close, and telling me not to blink. Then at the end, I reveal, "My grandmother was a sadist." The surprise lands because I built up to it. Another way to enhance surprise is by hiding critical details in plain sight. I call this planting a bomb. In This Is Going to Suck, I casually mention asking the nurse to call McDonald's to let them know I wouldn't be able to make my shift. It seems like a throwaway detail, but later it becomes the reason my friends show up at the hospital. By hiding the bomb in a list of mundane details, I ensure the audience doesn't see it coming. Laughter can also be great camouflage for surprise. In the same story, I joke about being worried about work right after dying in an ambulance. The humor distracts the audience, making the later reveal of my friend's arrival even more impactful. Surprise is what makes our stories memorable. It's what makes people laugh, cry, or gasp. And as storytellers, it's our job to craft those moments carefully, hiding the bombs, building the tension, and delivering the payoff at just the right time. Chapter 16. Milk Cans and Baseballs, Babies and Blenders. Simple, effective ways to be funny in storytelling, even if you're not funny at all. Let's talk about humor in storytelling. First, here's the hard truth: I can't make you a funny person. Some people, usually men, come into my workshops hoping I can teach them to be funny. I can't. Humor is a mix of wit, timing, confidence, and a dozen other things that are hard to teach. But you don't have to be funny to tell a great story. Even if you're not naturally funny, you can still craft stories with funny moments, and sometimes the situation itself is so absurd that it's funny no matter what. Take my story, Strip Club of My Own Making, about the time I stripped for a bachelorette party in the crew room of a McDonald's. That's funny on its own. You'd have to work hard to make it not funny. But stories shouldn't only be funny. The best ones use humor strategically, weaving it in to create a range of emotions. That's the difference between storytelling and stand-up comedy. Comedian wants you laughing the whole time. A storyteller wants you laughing at the right times. The humor in This Is Going to Suck. Let's break down how I use humor in my story about my near-fatal car accident, This Is Going to Suck. It's not a funny story. There's nothing inherently humorous about a head-on collision. But I use humor 4 times, each for a specific reason. 1. Start with a laugh. Early in the story, I describe how my friend Pat tells me, guys don't buy Christmas presents for other guys, especially surprise Christmas presents. That line usually gets a laugh. Why? Because it's relatable and unexpected. Starting with a laugh does 3 things. It signals to the audience that I know what I'm doing. It establishes control of the room, and it reassures them that despite the serious subject matter, I'm okay now. It's like saying, relax, I've got this. 2. Make them laugh before you cry. Just before the accident, I described my mother's car as the size of a box of Pop-Tarts and admit that I don't know what staring into the skid means. These lines get laughs, and that laughter makes the collision hit harder. Contrast is key in storytelling. The humor sets up the audience for the shock of what's coming. 3. Give them a breather. After the accident, a kid from a passing truck leans over to me and says, "Dude, you're fucked." That line always gets a laugh, especially when I follow it with, "It's the most accurate medical assessment I'll receive that day." This moment of humor lets the audience take a breath after the intense description of the crash. It's like hitting the reset button. And 4, end with a laugh to reset the tears. Near the end of the story, I mentioned the betta fish I bought as a Christmas gift was the only fatality of the accident. This line gives the audience a chance to collect themselves after the emotional reveal that my friends filled the hospital waiting room. It's a small laugh, but it's enough to prepare them for the final heartfelt conclusion. 2 simple humor strategies. If you're not naturally funny, don't worry. There are 2 simple techniques you can use to add humor to your stories. Number 1, milk cans and a baseball. Think of the carnival game where you knock over a stack of milk cans with your baseball. In storytelling, the milk cans are your setup and the baseball is your punchline. The more cans you can stack, the bigger the laugh when you knock them down. For example, in my story, Homeless and the Goat, I describe how I was rescued by a family of Jehovah's Witnesses and shared a tiny room with a guy who spoke in tongues in his sleep and their indoor pet goat. The word goat is the punchline, and it works because it's unexpected. I build up to it carefully, stacking the milk cans with details like tiny room and speaks in tongues before delivering the baseball. Number 2, babies and blenders. Humor often comes from putting 2 things together that don't belong, like babies and blenders. In one story, I describe my sweet, angelic 3-year-old son as a little asshole when it comes to food. The contrast between angelic and asshole makes people laugh. Similarly, in another story, I call my grandmother a sadist because of the way she pulled my loose tooth. Grandmother and sadist don't usually go together, which is why it's funny. The importance of heart. Here's the most important thing. Humor is optional, but heart is non-negotiable. A story that's all jokes and no heart won't stick with your audience. They might laugh in the moment, but they won't remember it. The best stories leave an emotional impact. So while humor can be a powerful tool, it should never be the only tool in your storytelling arsenal. End your story with something meaningful, something that connects with your audience on a deeper level. That's what makes a story truly unforgettable. Chapter 17, Finding the Frayed Ending of Your Story. Let me tell you, finding the meaning of a story can be a messy, uncomfortable process. It's not always clear why certain moments stick with us, why they linger in our minds and hearts for years. But those moments, the ones that won't let go, are often the ones that hold the most meaning. And sometimes you don't figure out what they mean till you start telling the story. Take my story, Eddie in a Bathtub. It's about a beating I took at band camp when I was a teenager. Not exactly a fun memory, right? For years, I didn't know why this moment haunted me. It was just there like a splinter in my brain. Then, during a workshop, my students picked this story from my spreadsheet of untold moments. I groaned. I didn't want to tell it. But I did. I told it raw, without worrying about craft or polish. I just let it spill out. This story was about the time I was involved in hazing, where I was the victim. In this case, it was an upperclassman, or a small team of upperclassmen, who tossed me in a bathtub, covered me with a combination of ingredients, flour, sugar, cornstarch, and yeast, and then ran warm water over me till the mixture congealed into a sticky substance that stuck to my skin. Eddie and his gang tossed me into the bathtub and began the doughboy process by pulling off my shirt and pouring the mix on my body. Once I was in the bathtub, I stopped struggling. There was no sense of fighting the inevitable. But I used the only weapon I had available to me, my mouth. I called them cowards, punks, future losers of America, 3 against 1, bunch of chickens, twice my size, you suck. One of them, Eddie, the big guy, his face darkened. Thought this was something that only happened in Stephen King novels, but no, I was witnessing it in real life. He clenched his fists. He was seething. I looked at the other 2 guys who were standing just behind Eddie. Our eyes met. They knew what was about to happen. They turned and walked out into the dorm hallway, and Eddie beat the hell out of me in that bathtub. He hurt me in a way I'd never been hurt before. It took everything I had to stop myself from crying. You know what? By the time I finished, I understood why that moment mattered. It had 2 meanings for me. First, it was the moment I realized that people will turn their backs on you in the face of evil. Second, it was the moment I learned the world is fundamentally unsafe, that people can hurt you for no good reason. Heavy stuff, right? But here's the kicker. A story can't be about 2 things. It has to have one clear meaning, one arc, so I had to decide which story I wanted to tell. If I wanted to tell a story about realizing the world is unsafe, I'd start with my belief that people are good and the world is safe. The arc would take the audience from innocence to cynicism. But if I wanted to tell a story about people turning their backs, I'd start with my faith in humanity and end with its loss. Same moment, 2 different stories. The details I include, the way I frame the story, it all depends on the meaning I choose. This process of finding meaning isn't just for storytellers. It's for anyone trying to make sense of their life. Sometimes you have to re-immerse yourself in a moment, tell it in all its messy, unpolished glory to figure out why it matters. I've seen this happen in my workshops. I've watched people break down in tears as they finally understand why a moment has stuck with them for so long. It's powerful, it's cathartic, and it's messy. Another way to find meaning is to ask yourself why you do the things you do. For example, my father and I communicate through letters. He disappeared for much of my childhood, and we're terrible on the phone. So letters became our thing. But the weirdest part, I never open his letters until I get a new one. Sometimes I'll hold on to an unopened letter for months. Why? I didn't know until my wife asked me about it. That's when I realized keeping an unopened letter is my way of holding on to my father. It's my way of ensuring he is still in my life. That realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Finding the frayed ending of your story, figuring out what the hell it all means, isn't easy. It's ugly and imperfect, but it's worth it. Because when you find that meaning, you not only tell a better story, you understand yourself a little better too. And isn't that what storytelling is about? Chapter 18, The Present Tense is King. Let me set the scene for you. I'm writing this chapter on an Amtrak train, heading from Washington, D.C. to Hartford, Connecticut. The train rocks back and forth, making it nearly impossible to type without typos. My wife Alicia is sitting beside me, earbuds in, working on a crossword puzzle. My 8-year-old daughter is reading quietly by the window, looking far more mature than her years. And then there's Charlie, my 5-year-old son, sitting next to her, fidgeting. Why? Because he needs to pee. Here's the thing about Charlie. He's decided that the train's restrooms are yuck. He's been holding it in since Aberdeen, New Jersey, and we are still hours away from home. I can't make him pee no matter how much I want to. Peeing, as it turns out, is one of those things that requires consent. So we've been making trips back and forth to the cafe car, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this time he'll decide the restroom is acceptable. Spoiler alert, it's not. This is where the magic of the present tense comes in. As I write this, I'm still on the train living this moment, and I want you to feel like you're here with me. The present tense creates immediacy. It pulls you into the story, making you feel like you're experiencing it alongside me. You're not just reading about a dad trying to convince his son to use a train restroom. You're on the train feeling the rocking motion, hearing the conductor punch tickets, and watching Charlie squirm in his seat. But stories don't always stay in the present tense. Sometimes you need to dip into the past to provide context or backstory. For example, I might tell you about the day I taught Charlie how to pee on a tree. That's a moment from the past, so it makes sense to shift into the past tense. Then when I bring you back to the train, I return to the present tense, pulling you back to the immediacy of the moment. This back and forth between the tenses isn't just a storytelling trick, it's a way to guide your audience through time. When done well, it's seamless. You don't even notice the time shifts. But when it's done poorly, it sticks out like a sore thumb. That's why it's important to be intentional about your tense choices. For instance, in this story, I use the present tense to keep you on the train with me. You're there as Charlie and I make another trip to the cafe car, only for him to declare, "No thank you," when faced with the dreaded porta potty restroom. You're there when he sighs and says, "I'm not proud of myself, breaking my heart into a million pieces," and you're there when we trudge back to our seats, defeated. When I tell you about the tree peeing lesson, I shift to the past tense. Why? Because it's a memory. It's not happening now. And by keeping it in the past, I preserve the immediacy of the train story. If I told both events in the present tense, it would be like putting a hat on a hat, confusing and unnecessary. The present tense isn't just about immediacy, it's also about visualization. When I tell a story in the present tense, I can see it in my mind's eye like a movie playing in my head. I can see the train, the cafe car, the restroom, and Charlie's little face as he struggles with his fear. And because I see it, you can too. So, here's the takeaway. The present tense is powerful. It's the king of storytelling. But the past tense, the queen, has its role too. Use them wisely, and you will create stories that pull your audience in, keep them engaged, and leave them feeling like they've lived the moment with you. And if you're wondering, yes, Charlie eventually peed, but that's a story for another time. Chapter 19. The Two Ways of Telling a Hero Story. Let's face it, nobody likes a braggart. Whether it's Proverbs 27:2 telling us to let others praise us, or Mark Twain comparing noisy bragging to a hen cackling over an egg, the message is clear. Boasting is a surefire way to alienate your audience. But here's the problem. Sometimes you have to tell a story about your accomplishments. Maybe it's a job interview, a college application, or meeting your in-laws for the first time. So how do you share your success without coming off as, well, a douchebag? The truth is, failure is inherently more engaging than success. Think about it. Would you rather hear about the ball player who struck out in the ninth inning to lose the World Series, or the one who hit the game-winning home run? The strikeout story is just better. It's relatable. It's human. Success stories, on the other hand, can feel flat or self-congratulatory. But don't worry, there are two strategies you can use to tell a hero story without making your audience roll their eyes. Strategy 1. Malign yourself. The first trick is to undermine yourself. Cast yourself as the underdog. Because everyone loves an underdog. Underdogs aren't supposed to win. So when they do, it's a surprise, and surprise is the lifeblood of storytelling. Think about movies like Rocky, The Karate Kid, or Rudy. These stories work because the protagonists are flawed, forgotten, or underestimated. When they succeed, it feels earned. For example, I once told a story called Bring Me a Shrubbery, about helping a shy student named Lisa find her voice through our shared love of Monty Python, the Holy Grail. But I didn't frame myself as a heroic teacher swooping in to save the day. Instead, I leaned into my own awkwardness and self-doubt. I made it clear that I stumbled into this moment of connection by accident. By maligning myself, I made the story more relatable and more enjoyable for the audience. Strategy 2. Marginalize your accomplishment. The second strategy is to downplay your success. Make it seem like no big deal. This doesn't mean you should lie or diminish your achievements, but you should frame them in a way that feels accessible. If you act like your success was inevitable, your audience will tune out. But if you make it seem like a happy accident, they'll root for you. Here's an example. I once told a story about meeting David Blaine, the world-famous magician. It could have been a straightforward, look how cool I am story, but instead I focused on my own disbelief and awkwardness. I described how Blaine performed a card trick so mind-blowing that I genuinely thought he might have made a deal with the devil. By framing the story around my own amazement, I made it less about my proximity to fame and more about the wonder of the moment. Both of these strategies, maligning yourself and marginalizing your accomplishment, work because they make your story about more than just you. They invite your audience to see themselves in your experience. They create connection, and that's what storytelling is all about. So the next time you need to tell a hero story, remember, it's not about making yourself look good. It's about making your audience feel something. Whether you're sharing a moment of triumph or a tale of failure, the goal is the same: to connect, to surprise, and to leave your audience with a story they'll never forget. Chapter 20. Storytelling is Time Travel. Let me tell you something that might sound a little hokey, but I promise it's worth considering. Storytelling at its best is time travel. Now, I'm not a spiritual guy. I don't meditate, pray, or believe in ghosts. I'm as grounded as they come. Egg McMuffin for breakfast every day. No yoga because there's no scoreboard. And I don't even toss coins into fountains. But when it comes to storytelling, I believe in a kind of magic. If I'm doing my job right, I can make you forget where you are, who you are, and even that I exist. I can take you back to a specific time and place for a moment, and you'll feel like you're there. Picture this: lonely New Hampshire highway in the fall of 1991, or the sidewalk outside a record store on December 23, 1988. If I'm telling the story well, you'll see it in your mind's eye. You'll feel the crisp air, hear the crunch of the leaves, or smell the rain on the pavement. That's the goal of storytelling: to create a movie in your brain that transports you to another time and place. It's not easy, though. This bubble of time travel is fragile, and it can pop in an instant if you're not careful. The rules of time travel and storytelling. To keep the magic alive, there are a few rules to follow. First, don't ask rhetorical questions. If you say something like, "Can you believe this?" you've just reminded the audience that they're sitting in a room listening to you. The bubble bursts. Similarly, don't address the audience directly with phrases like, "You guys won't believe this." It pulls them out of the story and back to the present. Props are another no-go. I once heard a guy tell a brilliant story about running through the Miami airport with his daughter, only to find out his ticket was for the wrong month. It was a great story until he pulled the ticket out of his pocket and waved it around. Suddenly, I wasn't in the Miami airport anymore. I was in a theater watching a guy with a piece of paper. The magic was gone. Avoid anachronisms, too. If you're telling a story set in 1960, don't compare something to the moon landing unless you're okay with reminding your audience that they're listening to a story in 2025. Even mentioning things that didn't exist at the time, like cell phones in the early 90s, can break the spell. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but it's best to steer clear whenever possible. Downplay yourself. When I'm on stage, I wear the same thing every time: jeans, a black t-shirt, and a hat. Not a fashion statement, it's a strategy. I want to fade into the background so the story can take center stage. Once I wore a t-shirt with Star Wars stormtroopers on it, and people in the audience started laughing before I even began. They weren't laughing at my story, they were laughing at my shirt. Lesson learned. A story that stuck. Let me give you an example of how this time travel works when done right. I once heard a story about a man who dragged his daughter through the Miami airport, treating everyone terribly, only to find out his ticket was for the wrong month. The storyteller described the heat, the crowds, and the chaos so vividly that I felt like I was there. I could hear the announcements over the PA system and feel the tension in the air. That's the power of storytelling when it's done well. But the moment he pulled out the ticket, the spell was broken. I was back in my seat watching a guy wave a piece of paper. The takeaway is this: storytelling is a delicate art. It's about creating a world so vivid and immersive that your audience forgets they're listening to a story. But it's also knowing about what not to do. No rhetorical questions, no props, no breaking the fourth wall. If you can follow these rules, you can take your audience on a journey through time and space. And trust me, there's nothing quite like it. Chapter 21. Words to say, words to avoid. Let's talk about words, the ones you choose to say, the ones you avoid, and how they shape your stories, and more importantly, how they shape how people see you. Words matter. They're the building blocks of storytelling, and they can either elevate your story or drag it down. So let's dive into some guidelines for choosing the right words and avoiding the wrong ones. Profanity, to swear or not to swear. I don't swear much in my stories, and it's not because I'm a prude. It's strategic. Swearing can limit your audience. If you want your stories to be aired on platforms like The Moth or shared in schools, religious institutions, or corporate settings, profanity can be a deal breaker. Plus, let's be honest, swearing is often lazy. There's usually a better, more creative word or phrase that can replace a curse word. That said, there are exceptions. Sometimes profanity is the best choice. These are some of those exceptions. Repeated dialogue. If someone in your story swears, and it's crucial to the moment, repeat it. For example, when a kid at my car accident said, "Dude, you're fucked," I kept it because it was authentic. Extreme emotion, anger, fear, or other heightened emotions can sometimes only be captured with a well-placed swear word. And humor. A perfectly timed curse can land a punchline like nothing else. But remember, swearing should be the spice, not the main ingredient. Vulgarity. Tread lightly. Vulgarity is a different beast. It's not just about swearing. It's about describing things that are inherently uncomfortable, like bodily fluids or sexual situations. The key here is to take care of your audience. You can be honest and authentic without being graphic or repulsive. For example, I once told a story about visiting a semen collection facility for genetic testing. I acknowledged the awkwardness of the situation, but used humor, euphemisms, and self-deprecation to set the scene without making anyone squirm. Contrast that with a friend who told a story about an unfortunate incident involving Thai food, a white couch, and a loss of bodily control. He described it in graphic detail, color, smell, texture, and the audience was repulsed. All he needed to say was, "I stood up, turned around, and saw a situation on the couch." That would have been enough to get a laugh without making people gag. Names. To name or not to name. When it comes to using real names in your stories, here's my rule. Change them if you need to protect someone's privacy, but make the new name easy to remember. Barry becomes Bobby. Sally becomes Sandy. Simple. As a teacher, I wait 5 years before telling stories about students. And even then, I only tell stories that reflect my own failures, not theirs. Sometimes, though, you just don't tell certain stories. If sharing it could damage a relationship, expose a secret, or jeopardize your job, it's not worth it. That said, I believe in naming the villains in our lives. My former stepfather, Neil McKenna, was a despicable human being who destroyed my mother's life and caused immense harm to my family. I say his name with enthusiasm because he deserves to be called out. Celebrity and pop culture references. Just don't. I used to compare people in my stories to celebrities. For example, I once described a former girlfriend as the kind of girl Zooey Deschanel plays in movies. Half the audience nodded in recognition, while the other half squinted in confusion. That's when I realized celebrity references are a bad idea. Here's why. 1. Alienation. Not everyone knows the reference, and you risk losing part of your audience. 2. Distraction. Mentioning a celebrity pops the storytelling bubble. If you say someone looks like Ronald Reagan, your audience will picture Reagan, and suddenly your story feels surreal. And 3. Laziness. Comparing someone to a celebrity is shorthand. It's better to describe them in a way that reveals their character. Instead of the Zooey Deschanel comparison, I now say, Jen was the kind of girl who never seemed to have a job but always had just enough money. She was carefree, the girl who would never grow up, never grow old, never worry or complain. That description makes people nod, smile, and laugh. No squinting required. Accents. A hard no. Here's the rule on accents. Don't do them. Imitating someone's accent, especially if it's from another culture, is risky and can come off as insensitive or racist. The only exceptions are 1. Parents and grandparents. Parental love can soften the potential hazards of imitating their accents. And 2. Your own region. If you grew up with a specific accent, it's usually okay to use it in your stories. But even then, tread lightly. When in doubt, skip the accent. Bottom line is this. Words are powerful. They can make or break your story. Choose them carefully, avoid the pitfalls of profanity, vulgarity, and lazy comparisons, and always take care of your audience. Because at the end of the day, storytelling is about connection, and the right words can make all the difference. Chapter 22. Time to perform. Let's talk about performance. Whether you're on stage, in a boardroom, on a date, or even at the Thanksgiving table, storytelling is a performance. And like any performance, it requires preparation, awareness, and a little bit of finesse. I performed in all these settings, and while the stakes may vary, the principles remain the same. Here's how to make your storytelling shine, no matter the venue. The nerves, when they hit, and how to handle them. I've only been nervous twice in my life while performing. The first time was at a Moth main stage event at Boston's Wilbur Theater, which I've already shared in Chapter 9. The second time was in 2015 when I told the robbery at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. This story was tied to my post-traumatic stress disorder, and while I thought I had healed enough to tell it, the experience proved otherwise. I stepped on stage, took a deep breath, and the next thing I knew I was walking off. I had no memory of the performance. Alicia, my wife, asked, "What happened?" I had told a coherent version of the story, but it wasn't the one I intended. I was angry, emotional, and defiant, leaving out reflective parts and including things I'd planned to cut. The sound engineer later told me, "I've never heard you get so upset on stage." I was reminded that even seasoned storytellers can be thrown off by the weight of their own stories. The lesson here is know your material and your emotional limits. If a story is too raw, it might not be ready for the stage. And if nerves hit, remember, you've prepared for this, trust your training, and keep going. Rehearsal, the right way to practice. Here's a tip that might surprise you. Never rehearse in front of a mirror. Why not? Because when you're performing, you'll never see yourself. Your audience doesn't care about the tilt of your head or the angle of your smile. They care about your words, your tone, and your connection with them. Practicing in front of a mirror only distracts you with things that don't matter. Instead, practice in front of people or even a wall. Focus on your words and delivery, not your appearance. When it comes to your hands, let them do what they naturally do. If you're thinking about your hands, you're thinking about the wrong thing. Eye contact is crucial for connection, but you don't need to make eye contact with every single person in the room. Instead, find 3 people, one on your left, one on your right, and one in the center. Choose people who are smiling, nodding, or otherwise engaged. These are your guideposts. By focusing on them, you'll make the entire audience feel seen. Controlling emotions, the balance between vulnerability and composure. Stories often touch on emotional moments, and it's okay to feel those emotions while telling them. But your emotions should never overwhelm your craft. If you're too emotional to speak, your audience will feel uncomfortable. Practice your story enough to manage your emotions, but don't strip them away entirely. A little vulnerability can make your story more powerful. The 7-scene rule, structuring your story. When I tell a story, I don't memorize the words. I memorize the scenes. I think of them as circles in my mind, each representing a part of the story. The size and color of the circle reflect the tone and importance of the scene. This method helps me stay on track even if I forget specific lines. I try to keep my stories to 7 scenes or fewer. Why 7? Because it's the most information the average person can retain at one time. Some of my stories only have 3 scenes, and one is just a single scene. The fewer scenes, the easier it is for your audience to follow. Bottom line, be present and be prepared. Whether you're telling a story on stage, in a meeting, or at a family gathering, the key is to be present and prepared. Know your material, connect with your audience, and trust yourself. Storytelling is a performance, but it's also a conversation. Make it meaningful, and you'll leave a lasting impression. Chapter 23. Why did you read this book? To become a superhero. Let's get straight to the point. You didn't read this book just to learn how to tell a good story. You read it to become a superhero. Yes, a superhero. Because storytelling, when done well, is a superpower. It's a skill that can make you stand out in a world where attention spans are shrinking and communication is often reduced to emojis and text messages. If you can hold an audience's attention, make them laugh, cry, and think, you have a power that's rare and invaluable. The Spider-Man principle of storytelling. Filmmaker Kevin Smith once said that anyone speaking to a group of people has a duty to be entertaining. I couldn't agree more. Whether you're talking to friends at a bar, students in a classroom, colleagues in a boardroom, or family at Thanksgiving, you have an obligation to engage your audience. Why? Because you're taking their time. If you're running a 1-hour meeting with 20 people, that's 20 hours of collective time you're using. You owe it to them to make it worthwhile. This is what I call the Spider-Man principle of storytelling. With great power comes great responsibility. If you can tell a story that entertains, informs, and inspires, you're not just a good storyteller, you're a superhero. Storytelling as a superpower. Think about it. The ability to communicate effectively and engagingly is a skill that can open doors. In 2015, I worked with a Brazilian engineering firm, and the CEO told me he'd rather hire a poorly trained engineer who could speak well than a highly skilled one who couldn't. Why? Because communication is key. He could teach someone to be a better engineer, but teaching someone to communicate effectively, that's a much harder task. This applies to every aspect of life. On a first date, storytelling can make you memorable. As a parent, it can turn life lessons into cherished memories. As a teacher, it can make your lessons stick. And in the workplace, it can set you apart from the PowerPoint drones who bore their audiences to tears. The responsibility of storytelling. When you tell a story, you're not just sharing information, you're creating an experience. And with that comes responsibility. You have to be entertaining. Yes, but also authentic and vulnerable. People connect with stories that feel real, that show the storyteller's humanity. This is why storytelling is so powerful. It's not just about the words you say, but the emotions you evoke. Becoming a superhero. So why did you read this book? To learn how to tell stories that matter, to connect with people on a deeper level, to make them laugh, cry, and think, to become a superhero in a world that desperately needs more of them. This book is your instruction manual. Now it's up to you to practice, to collect your stories and to share them. Because the world needs your voice, it needs your stories, and it needs you to be the superhero you were meant to be. This has been Storyworthy, Part 2 by Matthew Dix. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you'd love to learn more, there are tons of examples in the book. Pick up a copy of the book, Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. That's where we'll leave it. Thanks for joining. That's a wrap.